Welcome to St. Jerome's University, and welcome to the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience. My name is David Seljak, and if we can stop drinking, we can get started. And I am the director of the center as well as a professor in the Department of Religious Studies here. I think I'll stop that for now and switch over. Hold on. Wonderful. It actually works. I'm surprised. Welcome today on this rather snowy November evening, and thank you for making the trek out in this weather. The theme of the 2005-2006 lecture series at the St. Jerome Center for Catholic Experience is called The Amazing Church. And in it we are celebrating the great changes in the church in the last 40 years. This title is stolen from Gregory Baum's new book. In this book, one of the great changes that Baum outlines and celebrates is the adoption of the concept of the church for others. Before the Second Vatican Council, he writes, the church considered itself a self-contained community and acted in the best interests of that community. In contrast to this attitude, Baum cites the startling and audacious opening of the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, and I quote, "The joys and hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these too are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts." How appropriate that the theme today, the theme of today's 2005-2006 Teresa Deese lecture is Learning Justice, Compassion, and Hope-Filled Action, to be given by Sister Pat Murray. Welcome, Sister Murray. The Deese lecture was endowed by the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the Loreto Sisters. It honors Mother Mary Teresa Deese, the superior of the first convent of the IBVM in North America. She was superior general until her death in 1889. Actually, I heard today the story of how the sisters came over and established the first women's religious community in Toronto, and there were 5 of them who came over. 3 of them, unfortunately, died. 1 of them went back home, and Teresa Deese was the one who stayed. And I think that's how she became Mother Superior. Though I'm sure she was infinitely qualified. The Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary was founded by an Englishwoman, Mary Ward, in 1609. And her dream was to be a woman religious in the service of the world. In other words, to be the church for others. Modeled after the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, these women wanted to respond in faith to the urgent needs of her time. Mary Ward was imprisoned by the Inquisition and initially condemned by the Church. Those who live in a church for others are not always welcome. But her charism could not be contained so easily, and it now lives on in the members of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary throughout the world. The IBVM amazes us all with its commitment to share in the joys, hopes, griefs, and anxieties of the people of this age, especially the poor. Their mission statement announces, and I quote, "Impelled by the values of justice, freedom, and integrity, we work to integrate our active apostolic spirituality in communion for mission with the conviction that our mission is to stand in a direct way with the powerless, those on the fringes of society." We are pleased that a number of the Loreto sisters could be here with us today for this celebration of their spirit and their work. And I welcome especially Sister Doreen Kirby, who works with me on these lectures, and the provincial Carmen Diston. So welcome here tonight. Tonight's lecture is called Learning Justice, Compassion, and Hope-Filled Action. And Sister Murray will be drawing on her experiences across the world with people in the lands of the Lakota Sioux, post-communist Bulgaria, the Turkana Desert, and even Calcutta in India. And Sister Murray explores the challenges contained in those words, justice, compassion, and hope. She offers personal strategies as well as educational strategies for individuals and for groups to develop that hope-filled action that enriches human living. And she challenged us to develop and deepen a spirituality that will influence everyday living, our own living, as members of a global community. Since 1998, Sister Murray has served as the General Counsultor for the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and she is based in Rome. She has special responsibility for coordinating international initiatives in education, as well as justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. In this capacity, she has traveled to many countries, including India, South Africa, Mauritius, Vietnam, Australia, Peru, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Spain, and the United Kingdom. Welcome finally to Canada, Sister Murray. Here at the University of Waterloo, our provost is very enthusiastic about a program of internationalization. He wants to expose students and faculties to, he wants to encourage us to internationalize our studies, to expose our students to world issues, and to bring in speakers from around the world to speak with our students. And I think just with Sister Murray's visit tonight, St. Jerome's has filled its quota on the internationalization. Anyway, Sister Murray has a master's degree in theology with a cross-cultural studies concentration from the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago and has lectured at many colleges, including Trinity College Dublin, University College Dublin, and St. Patrick's College in Maynooth. And you might pick up a slight Irish accent later on tonight. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Sister Pat Murray.
Sister Carmen is going to help me with the wonders of technology here. Good night, friends. It is with great pleasure that I come to speak here at St. Jerome's. And I think you'll find that my presentation this evening is drawing on my experiences throughout the last 30 to 40 years of my life as an IBVM sister. And I've been involved in various missions and various contexts, and these have influenced me greatly. So what I'm sharing with you this evening is really a mixture of inspiration and praxis that has grown out of my involvement over many years. And I offer you a personal reflection on the theme that you see before you, learning justice, compassion, and hope-filled action. And I'm subtitling it with the following: how to nurture a spirituality of social transformation. Because I think this is the challenge to all of us as Christians in our world today. And I'm a storyteller. You can't be Irish without being a storyteller. So you'll hear me tell many stories this evening. But I want to begin by sharing a modern-day parable with you. Recently I read Barbara Kingsolver's novel Animal Dreams. And in it you have two characters, Hallie and Cody. Hallie has been working as a volunteer in Nicaragua, and Cody is back in the United States, and she's feeling lost and very insecure in the journey of life. She wants more than anything to talk to Hallie. She wants to ask her what to do, how to live life without guarantees, without safety. And then Cody finds a letter, an old letter that Hallie has written to her, and she begins to read this letter as if reading it for the first time. And this is what the letter says. Hallie says, "Cody, here's what I've decided. The very least that you can do with your life is to figure out what you hope for. And the most that you can do is to live inside that hope. Not admire it from a distance, but live right inside under its roof. What I want is so simple, I almost can't say it. Elementary kindness, enough to eat, enough to go around, the possibility that kids might one day grow up to be neither destroyers nor the destroyed. That's about it. Right now, I'm living inside that hope, running down its hallways, touching the walls on both sides. I can't tell you how good it feels. I wish you knew." Later on in the novel, Cody is talking to her father, and she tells him that she's trying to figure out what she wants to do with life. and life has been extremely difficult for them as a family. Her father, Pop, says to her, "It's a most dangerous thing, hope, because it involves giving a lot of yourself away." And then he adds, "It's hard to give so much away when you're the subject of widespread disapproval and your heart is leaking from puncture wounds." And Cody says to her father, "That's true, Pop. We got punctured pretty bad, but we still gave the world a lot." I love that line. We got punctured pretty bad along the way, but we still gave the world a lot. Because in many ways, it's the puncture wounds of life that are the source of grace and inspiration. It's a most dangerous thing, hope. Like Hallie, if our hope is big enough, it can lead you and I to dream impossible dreams. It can dare us to go to new frontiers. It can ask us to walk among people who are different to you and I, to go to new places, to undertake new and courageous actions. You know, the poets write about hope. In the middle of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Seamus Heaney, the great Irish poet, penned the following lines. He said, "So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a farther shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells." I know I believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. I know I believe that this world can be a better place for each and every one. But I believe that we have to articulate our hope, that hope of a reachable farther shore. Because when we name our hope, it gives us the energy and the impetus to cross barriers of bitterness, hatred, and revenge. And we're invited, you and I, in hopeful action, to plant small seeds like gospel mustard seeds, seemingly perhaps insignificant actions, but actions that will have enormous influence over the course of time. So as we gather here this evening, each one of us here in this hall, we have hope in our heart for ourselves and for our world. We want to become a people alive to the world instead of merely existing and reacting to the world. I think Hallie's story teaches me the importance of two things. Firstly, to have words that inspire me, to help me name my dream for the world. Remember, she said, what I want is elementary kindness. And secondly, having a focused reality in which to act out my hope. Hallie had that focused context in Nicaragua with children. So where do we get words that inspire us? Strangely enough, Catholic social teaching has many words of inspiration. And here are some phrases that challenged me in my early journey. A phrase like, have a passion for the earth and its people. Enter into solidarity with victims of injustice. Have a love of preference for the poor, or to promote justice is to transform structures that block love. In the early 1970s, when I read these phrases, they set a fire in my heart. But how to respond? Looking at Catholic social teaching, there are at least 8 key principles which I think can offer us direction and purpose in life. And I would like to share some of these with you this evening. But in sharing each of these themes from Catholic social teaching, I also want to share an experience with you where I believe people have acted or are acting with hope and courage to make a difference. I've put these 8 in front of you on the slide, but I'll deal with them one by one. The first one is faith linked with justice. And we're reminded again and again in Catholic social teaching that action for justice and to participate in the transformation of the world is a constitutive element of the preaching of the gospel. In other words, it's not an optional extra. To be a believer is automatically to be somebody who commits herself or himself to act for change in the world. So as Christians, we're obligated to get involved in changing structures. We're obligated to look at what is oppressing and excluding people. And this often demands very courageous action. Only last year, I read the following account of a student in one of our schools in Calcutta in India. And the following was written in a local newspaper. It said the screams of agony and terror of a 9-year-old child were ignored by all the neighbours who shared the high-rise building when little Sarita Singh was being beaten daily. Then, a quiet, slender girl from class 12 of Loreto Sealda moved into the block with her family. When she heard the screams, she went to investigate. She found out the cause, mobilized the apathetic neighbours, called the police, rescued the child, and this child had been employed 2 years earlier, at the age of 7, as a domestic servant in a house. Then they discovered that this little child was almost totally blind because she had been hit with a bare fist, somebody who had a signet ring. And a cataract was diagnosed, and when this was removed, the child could see again. But this situation of injustice was transformed by the courageous action of a 16-year-old girl. Where in our neighbourhoods are there situations that call for courageous action from you and from me? Because, in our contemporary society, often our first inclination is to draw back from situations of need. The second pillar of Catholic social teaching is the dignity of the human person, because the Church's teaching rests on one basic principle, and that is that human beings are the foundation, the cause, and the end of every social institution. Therefore, all economic, political, and social life must be centred on humanity. And respect for each person is shown in practice when we respect a person's fundamental human rights, including the right to have their basic needs met and the right to integral development. You and I know that when a person's basic human rights are violated, the inner core of a person is damaged. And in fact, the very fabric of society is damaged. And that struck me forcibly some years ago when I attended a conference in Bulgaria, and I was representing the Irish government there. It was a conference where teachers were learning how to teach democratic values. And I was asked at one point in the conference to speak about schooling in Ireland. And I actually spoke about my own school, an IBVM school, where the core values are values of justice, freedom, sincerity, and truth. And as I looked down into the audience, there was a woman in the front row, and she was crying. And I said to the interpreter, "Have I upset her in any way? Have I said something offensive?" And the interpreter addressed the woman and asked her, would she like to speak? And the woman spoke about life in Bulgaria and how the Secret Service regime had fostered a spying system where children had reported on parents, parents on children, employee on employer, and vice versa, neighbour on neighbour. And she said to me, the school that you are describing sounds like heaven on earth. She said, help us rebuild a society which will respect human rights and work to build trust and solidarity. And I'm happy to say that that teacher, together with many others in modern-day Bulgaria, have been doing exactly that, instilling new values, new human values into the core of Bulgarian society and giving people back their dignity and their pride. The third pillar is the promotion of the common good. You and I know that the common good is the sum total of human conditions which allow individuals and groups to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily in a society. Gaudium et Spes tells us every social group must take account of the needs and legitimate aspirations of other groups, and even of the general welfare of the entire human family. And I think we're very aware that when people don't have a share of the common good, they do desperate things to try and improve their life conditions. When I went to Rome in 1998, I could say honestly that I was almost unaware of the extent of the problem of the trafficking of human persons for sexual and economic exploitation. But within a very short time in Rome, it was so visible on the street. About 500,000 people are trafficked into Europe every year, and they would say that 2 million people, in fact, are trafficked throughout the world each year. Every single one of our countries is either a country of origin, of transit, or of destination. So many people come searching for the common good, coming with dreams of building a good life. Many are tricked into thinking they are coming to Europe to work in restaurants or factories or shops, or they think they will find work as secretaries, models, nannies, nurses, or au pair workers. They want to send money home to rebuild their families and their communities, but they end up in sweatshops and in prostitution. And yet already I see signs of hope on the landscape, because 5 years ago, this phenomenon of trafficking was not in the public arena, whereas now today it is. I know in Italy, many people each day visit detention centres to be with the women. And there are over 200 safe houses throughout Italy, so that those who denounce their traffickers can receive a safe haven. The next pillar is the pillar of solidarity. 3 levels of solidarity are highlighted in Catholic social teaching: human, social, and international. At the level of human solidarity, we're told that a unique bond exists between us as members of the human family, so that this gives rise to fundamental relationships of solidarity, which is a duty. Solidarity helps us, we're told, to see the other person, whether a person, a people, or a nation, not just as some kind of instrument with a work capacity and physical strength to be exploited at low cost, and then discarded when no longer useful. But the other is our neighbour, a helper, to be made a sharer on a par with ourselves in the banquet of life. At the level of social solidarity, society must show particular care for the poor, the vulnerable, and the exploited. And as Christians, we're called to take a stand beside the poor, to discern the justice of their requests, and to help satisfy them without losing sight of the good of groups in the context of the common good. And finally, at the level of international solidarity, the structures of the international order must reflect justice. And you and I must denounce the existence of economic, financial, and social mechanisms which often function automatically, but they accentuate the situation of wealth for some and poverty for the rest. To keep our hope alive, you and I think, have to look throughout the world at examples of solidarity today. People who put their lives on the line. We have many who are very visible: the Oscar Romeros, the Martin Luther Kings, the Gandhis. But there are many, many people in our societies who, by being participants in NGOs, in local community groups, are part of a movement for social change. And when I think about solidarity, I often think of a young woman called Jean Donovan, who you may remember worked in El Salvador as a Caritas coordinator and was killed by a death squad together with 3 Maryknoll sisters. I often read Jean Donovan's words. She wrote to a friend maybe 2 weeks before she was assassinated and said the following. She said, "Several times I have decided to leave El Salvador. I almost could, except for the children. They are the bruised victims of this insanity. Who would care for them if I went? Whose heart would be so staunch as to favour the reasonable thing in a sea of their tears and helplessness? Not mine, dear friend, not mine." So Jean Donovan stayed in solidarity with the children of El Salvador and gave her life for them. I'm inspired by many unnamed people who have gone to remote and often dangerous places in solidarity with those who are suffering in order to make a difference. But you know, friends, sometimes those remote and dangerous places are very near where we live. And we have to seek and search them out. The 5th pillar is economic justice. Catholic social teaching points out that the economy is for the people, and the right to work, to organise workers, to receive just wages, and to enjoy humane working conditions are to be respected. Centesimus Annus says, "Here we find a wide range of opportunities for commitment and effort in the name of justice on the part of trade unions and other worker organisations. These defend workers' rights and protect their interests as persons, and enable workers to participate more fully and honourably in the life of their nation." And yet many of the workers in our countries are what we term illegals. And we know what their working conditions, we can only guess sometimes what their working conditions are like. And yet I still see the giant murals of Cesar Chavez on the walls of a school in the Mission District of San Francisco. This is a wonderful way of promoting social awareness. Paint the walls. And he led the migrant Californian fruit pickers in their struggle for human rights. But that same struggle for a decent wage goes on today throughout the world. Recently I visited Panigatta in India, where the women and children who are picking tea get the equivalent of 50 cents a day for a basket that weighs 30 kgs. And I think of the tea I drink each day. Do I bring an awareness of what the workers of the world often have suffered to provide me with the products on my table? Often those who campaign for workers' rights risk their own lives. Recently, you and I would have read about Sister Dorothy Stang, who was murdered in Brazil. And she was supporting a trans-Amazon development project, which was generating jobs and income for the Anapu region. They were creating a fruit processing industry, constructing hydroelectric power plants and reforesting areas. However, they were a threat to the loggers, the ranchers, and the large farmers. People like Dorothy Stang challenge me to support the fair trade movement and to buy fair trade products so that workers throughout the world can get a fair price for their labour. Number 6 is the universal destination of goods. Catholic social teaching tells us that the resources of the earth are given by God for the good of the whole human family, and that all property has a social mortgage. That is, it is entrusted to individuals and to groups so that the needs of all people can be met. St. Ambrose is particularly challenging in this regard because, and he is often quoted in Catholic social teaching, he says that when we share our possessions with another, we are not making a gift of our possessions to the poor person. In fact, we're handing over to him or to her what is his or hers. And what he says was, for what has been given for the use of all, you have arrogated to yourself. The world is given to all and not only to the rich. So there's an obligation for those of us who have to give. And in another place he says in a very challenging way, if you have 2 coats, you have stolen one from the poor. In other words, what is surplus to need should be given away. I saw a beautiful example of that attitude of mind and heart when staying for a short period with the Lakota Sioux in South Dakota. And I was part of a cross-cultural training program. And it was the birthday of a 12-year-old boy. He was the grandson of Tilly Black Bear, who was our teacher. And he was given a lovely white cowboy hat for his birthday. And of course that challenged me in itself, a cowboy hat on a little Indian boy, all my stereotypes. But when he took the white hat out of the box, the first thing he did was take the black hat he was wearing and place it on his cousin's head. For the Lakota Sioux have a custom that if you receive a gift, you immediately must give a gift. You know, that simple practice could start a revolution. Every time we got something, if we gave something away. The next pillar is political participation. Democratic participation in decision-making is an important way of respecting the rights and dignity of people. And we're told in Catholic social teaching that political participation guarantees to the governed the possibility both of electing and holding accountable those who govern them and of replacing them through peaceful means when appropriate. But isn't it so important for people to feel that they have control over their own lives, to feel that they are respected and valued by their leaders? Some years ago I read, I suppose it was of a very, I read about the Dalit people of India, a very excluded group, and how they were treated by their civic and religious leaders. The Dalits are the untouchables or the non-persons. And they have experienced many different kinds of exclusion and rejection. And one of them wrote the following. He said, "My Dalit ancestor was cast out of his village. He walked the dusty roads. The Savarna are the religious leaders, tied a branch around his waist so that he would not leave any unclean footprints and pollute the road. The Savarna also tied an earthen pot around my Dalit ancestor's neck to serve as a spittle. My Dalit ancestors were denied access to any public wells and reservoirs." That's an extreme example in a particular country. But many of the Dalit people and the Dalit groups in India have been campaigning for political and social rights for their people for the past 50 years. And they've joined with other marginal groups to engage in non-violent political action for change. But you know, when I read about the Dalits, I said to myself, who are the Dalits or the untouchables near me? Who are those who feel alienated from society and who feel condemned, ignored and rejected by the political and social processes in which I'm part of? The 8th pillar is the pillar of peace. God desires shalom, fullness of life for all people. Catholic social teaching tells us that peace is the work of justice and the effect of charity. And we're called on to promote the non-violent resolution of conflict and to educate for peace. But education for peace is difficult and demanding, particularly in societies marked in many ways by oppression and exclusion. I worked for many years in the north of Ireland, and I just give you one small example of how early we learn our prejudices in life. In fact, I think the scholars would say that we have gathered our bag of prejudices by age 7. I was visiting a classroom in Northern Ireland, and a teacher pointed out a little 5-year-old boy. And he said to me, "You see that little boy there? He refuses to colour with a green crayon. Because for that little boy, green meant Catholic and green meant Republican or nationalist." So already a colour had assumed a category for him. If we want peace, we must work for justice. Mater et Magistra says to us that the nations of the world are becoming more and more dependent on each other, and it will not be possible to preserve a lasting peace as long as glaring economic and social imbalances persist. And yet, so much money in our world is spent on making war. Or if not on making war, on employing peacekeepers to prevent warring factions from recommencing war. And so there are some figures there in front of you. 35 trillion have been spent on wars since 1945. In the last 10 years, over 2 million children have been killed, 6 million people maimed, 1 million orphans created, and 12 million refugees. And yet, the 5 major arms spenders are the USA, Japan, UK, France, and China. And 90% of all arms deliveries to Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa come from the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. I mean, when you look at that, there's such a double speak in the way we speak and act in our world. Yet there is hope growing. In Rome, 1 million people recently walked for peace. There's a growing disarmament and anti-war movement. And I think when millions walk to show that they want and desire peace, hope rises in our midst. And the last pillar is the pillar integrity of creation. Catholic social teaching reminds us that we as men and women have to see ourselves as part of nature and to live in a respectful and harmonious partnership with all other life forms. We are co-creators in the development of the earth, but we must respect the integrity of creation, and our development must be sustainable. The document Justice in the World says those who are already rich are bound to accept a less material way of life with less waste in order to avoid the destruction of the heritage which they are obliged by absolute justice to share with other members of the human race. And yet, I put some disturbing figures before you. First of all, you look at the waste that we create in our world. 10 billion tons of pollution flowing into the oceans of the world. 40% of the world having no access to safe drinking water. 33 million people in India alone displaced because of the construction of huge dams. 80% of the forests that once covered the earth have been destroyed, and then the effect of greenhouse gases on the atmosphere. You and I know the reality. And yet change is coming, because the number of regeneration and reforestation projects are growing in every country. And politicians and scientists are beginning to tackle the problem of global warming because citizens like you and like me are demanding change. And so I just want to say some words about the biblical vision of justice, peace, and compassion. Because our Christian understanding of justice comes from the Old Testament and the experience of that Exodus community. They were a nomadic people. They crossed difficult and continually changing land. But they knew that the individual could not survive apart from the community. And so for the Hebrews, justice was a harmony that came from right relationship. And that right relationship was with the covenant Lord, with whom they had a covenant bond. But that covenant bond immediately linked them with neighbour and land. And so for the Hebrews, to act justly was to help sustain the life of the community and to care for the earth. And we're told in the Old Testament that the just person was to do as Yahweh did. And Yahweh searches for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the person on the margin. And Yahweh always searches with steadfast love, mercy, and compassion. You know, that wonderful line in the Old Testament, I will never forget you, my people. I have carved your name on the palm of my hand. And in a sense, that's what you and I are challenged to do and to be in relation to those who are marginalized and excluded. In our hearts, we have to say, I will never forget you. Oppressed people. In the Old Testament, there are 11 different words that describe oppression. And really, oppression means people who feel hemmed in, suffocated, cornered, without choices in life. And they are all around us, those who feel oppressed. They're in our schools and neighbourhoods. They're on our buses and trains. They live down the road from us. Maybe they live beside us. And mercy and compassion. The Hebrew word for mercy is rahamin, which means womb. Therefore, merciful or compassionate love is womb love. A love that issues from the deepest core of a person. So that when you and I are in the presence of suffering, from our deepest core, that love and compassion can well forth. And we're invited as Christians to develop a habit of mind and heart, an enduring stance that we will take towards those we see suffering in our world today. The Irish writer John O'Donoghue says, when your affection is kindled, the world of your intellect takes on a new tenderness and compassion. But you know, our affections are only kindled when we enter fully into the lives of those who are oppressed and marginalized. I often think of the Good Samaritan. He had to get off the horse and go into the ditch, because the ditch doesn't come looking for us. But to do that, we have to overcome often our fears, our prejudices, and our judgments. And so, shalom or peace, that beautiful concept of fullness of life, it was more than the pax of the Romans, which was the absence of violence, more than the eirene of the Greeks, which was the breaking down barriers. But the shalom of the Hebrews was fullness of life for each person and for all in the community at every level. And so, in a sense, you and I are challenged to develop a spirituality of justice, of compassion and mercy, and of peace. And I'm convinced that as global citizens we have to say to ourselves, how large is my world? How wide is my tent the tent of my heart? Who do I include or exclude? And the Spanish writer José Ortega y Gasset says, tell me the landscapes in which you live and I will tell you who you are. And this isn't about travelling physically around the world, even though I've done a lot of it. But I think the landscapes that live within me can be landscapes that reach me through what I read about, through what I see on television, what I see in places where I live and work, what I choose to get involved in, what I decide to do with my free time. In other words, there's a multitude of experiences out there in my world. Will I let them into my heart so that they will shape me? For those experiences really can serve as gateways to the divine. Someone has said, in order to become just, compassionate and hopeful people, we have to carry within us the memory of the tears of things and the memory of the hopes of things. We must carry within us people's tears, but we must equally carry within us examples of hope, where we have seen change and seen people who make a difference. And so I like to talk about the landscapes of the heart, because the way in which you and I look at the world, particularly look at those parts of the world that are suffering, they're ways in which you and I can be transformed. Frederick Turner talks about entering the mythic zone, where we finger the skin of the world. I think the incidents that I've shared with you tonight, they're some examples of the ways in which I have fingered the skin of the world. They form part of the landscape of my heart. They're places and people that I can revisit again and again. They're not past events. They're present memories of the tears of things and of the hopes of things, because they encourage me to enter into solidarity and to engage in action to make a change in today's world. You know, I come from the land of the Celts, and the Celtic peoples always talked about thin places. And they were places where the distance between God and the people had narrowed, and the hidden presence of God appeared. And I believe deeply that places of suffering are thin places. But they're often places we're afraid to go. We know we'll see the presence of God in situations that are joyful, contented, happy, in beautiful scenery. But to enter into situations of degradation, of vulnerability, of exclusion, God is present there too. In my experience, where I've had the courage to enter places and situations where people are broken, I've been profoundly changed. Because the poor and the oppressed are blessed. They're blessed because they challenge my hardness of heart and my superficial living. And when my heart is touched, the impact that I have, that you can have on others, is immeasurable. Because we will begin to project what is happening deep within us in the landscape of our heart onto our work, onto our relationships, onto the whole of our life. And there's an important learning relationship. Because when meeting people and situations marked by brokenness and vulnerability, there needs to be a relationship of real mutuality. The poor and oppressed have to be the leaders in the dialogue, not because they're better, not because they're holy, not because they're the majority, but we simply follow God's lead. Because we're told in Scripture that the privileged place for finding God has always been in the struggles of the poor. And by entering into the struggles of the poor and oppressed, we discover our own vulnerability and our own poverty. The poor truly become our teachers. And if we're willing, we can become reachers. because at the core of this new relationship of mutuality is a desire to help one another, to remove the stumbling blocks that exist in both our lives so that both of us can become truly, fully human persons. And so, in the last part of what I want to say to you tonight, I want to look at some of the elements that are necessary when learning about justice, compassion, and hope. And I'm drawing on some statements from the Synod of Bishops and their document, Justice in the World, from 1907. And I find these very valuable for personal reflection. The first challenge is that we need to learn to live our lives in accordance with the principles of personal and social morality. And I think the more advantages we have in life, the greater our responsibility to work for social change. I often recall the words of Jean Vanier, where he challenged us as persons. He said, "Whose side are you on? As doctors, lawyers, hairdressers, secretaries, accountants, teachers, factory workers, whose side are you on?" We're challenged in this document. It says that the method of education today very frequently still encourages a narrow individualism. And I put this challenge to you and to myself. We're knowledgeable people, but knowledge now is seen as a private possession. As students often learn to be individualistic and competitive. Knowledge has been turned into a product. Why do we learn? Can we use our knowledge for the benefit of those on the margins of society? We're challenged to develop a critical sense which will lead us to reflect on our society and to live on it and to challenge its values when they cease to promote justice for all. Often when I'm reading a newspaper article or watching television, I ask myself, who's providing this information in this program and whose cause does it serve? When I'm walking the streets of my city or cities and country places, I look at how people are treated, and particularly those who are economically deprived. I try to get inside the skin of people who feel that they're on the margins of society. I remember a wonderful character in Dublin saying to me in good Dublinese, she said, "Sister Pat, if I had €100 for every PhD student that interviewed me, I'd be a rich woman." She said, "They've climbed the academic ladder on the back of my poverty." You know, walking the street can be a type of contemporary pilgrimage. Because, you know, you don't see much when you travel by car. You actually miss a lot of what's happening. It's a good exercise in lots of ways. Learning about justice, peace, and integrity of creation, we're told it will inculcate a truly and entirely human way of life in justice, love, and simplicity. I know, friends, that I have been changed at the core of my being by people who have lived in poverty and vulnerability. They have given me so much in terms of deepening my personhood and my humanity. We're challenged to awaken consciences to a knowledge of the concrete situation, and we're called to secure a total improvement. I believe that if you and I are not involved in one issue, then we're not truly involved. I often challenge people, find an issue, an area in which you yourself can get involved. And I have a practice that I call hope spotting. Because the media tells us all the bad news. I look for examples of situations, people and places where there's good news to tell. Because, you know, the United Nations would tell us that, in fact, looking at global statistics, more people are, in fact, housed, fed, can read and write than ever before. Things actually are improving. Learning about justice and peace makes people more human when we enable them to take a hand in their own destinies. I saw that clearly in the north of Ireland. We taught political skills to young people, both Protestant and Catholic, helped them to analyse the situation in their country, and showed them ways of choosing peaceful action for transformation rather than violence. And finally, learning about justice is practical. It comes through action, participation, and vital contact with the reality of injustice. And so, in coming to the end, I would just offer two models. You will have seen these before, they're not new. But this first model, which is called the cycle of pastoral praxis, I use it as a way of living my life. The first step is experience. So I challenge myself to be open to experience so that the landscape of my heart can be widened. But being open to experience, I've had to learn how to smell, taste, touch, see and hear. To develop that sensibility and sensitivity, to be attentive to my world, particularly the world of those who are excluded. And then looking at the second step, which is the step of social analysis, analysing issues, systems, structures, policies and processes in society. But when reading analysis, asking myself, who's doing the analysis? And who is benefiting from this analysis? And is there another perspective that should be included in this analysis? And then finally, the third step, looking at what is Catholic social teaching? What is Scripture inviting me to as a person trying to live justly, mercifully, compassionately, and hopefully? What are the values that when I look at my society that I now have to challenge and act to change? And that last action, to look at the 2 feet of action. There is direct service, which is where we help people to survive their present crisis of poverty, marginalisation and exclusion. And there's a long list of ways in which we can reach out with mercy to people who are in direct need now for food, shelter, clothing or housing. But then there's the second foot of social change, where you and I are challenged to join with others to help remove the causes of the social problems that exist in our society and in our world. In a sense, both of these are ways that foster what I call a prophetic consciousness, a way of being deeply inserted into the transformation of society and of the world. And so in conclusion, I'm going to draw on the words of an IBVM past pupil. She's Wangari Maathai, who you may remember was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003. And Wangari founded the Green Belt movement in 1977. And this was to organize women in rural Africa to plant millions of trees in order to combat the problem of deforestation and to provide fuel for village cooking fires. She's at the forefront of the fight to promote ecologically viable social, economic and cultural development in Kenya and in Africa. One of her daughters said this about her. She said, she told us so often that nothing was impossible. She had fire on the inside, and she tried to give some of that to us too. I think Wangari Maathai is a wonderful example of somebody who, living with awareness and compassion for the world and its people, engaged in hope-filled action. May you and I too have fire on the inside. May that fire challenge us, if we haven't already done so, to get involved in some, even small, project for social change. Because, if each of us is sowing our seeds of hope, it makes a difference cumulatively over time. We become a network. We spread out, we fan out into society and into the world. And I'll end with the words of Margaret Wheatley, because she beautifully describes this network of change. She says, "We never know who we are. This is strange, isn't it? Or what vows we've made, or who we know, or what we hoped for, or where we were when the world's dreams were seeded, until the day just one of us sighs a gentle longing, and we all feel the change. One of us calls a name, and we all know to be there. One of us tells a dream, and we all breathe life into it. One of us asks why, and we all know the answer." Yes, my friends, it is strange. You and I will never know who we truly are until we engage in living justly, compassionately, with hope in our hearts. And now we must take the next step ourselves. Thank you very much indeed.